Good evening. This is Heartstock Radio, and I'm Carol Murphy, your host. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you can find us on Facebook or email us at heartstockradio@gmail.com. This evening, we have a very special guest in celebration of International Women's Day. Petra Kassun-Mutch will be back in just a moment and share her story. It's a lot. And we may have to have her back. I keep saying that with many of our guests because she's got some really meaty stuff to share. Thanks for listening. This is Heartstock.
It didn't say nothing. That time was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to New York Island, from Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.
This is Heartstock Radio. I'm Carol Murphy, your host, and our guest this evening is Petra Kassun-Mutch. Hi, Petra.
Hi, Carol. How are you?
Thank you so much for being on Heartstock. Can you do a little brief intro for our listeners, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a size-gender Gen X single-parent mom, a romantic partner to a fabulous musician, or at least I think so, and a 3 to 4 time entrepreneur, if you include my macrame business when I was about 10, and the former president of a $45 million McGraw-Hill publishing company here in Canada. I'm currently working on building a global feminist business media company called LiisBeth. So I'm working on that. And as a side hustle to kind of fund that, I also teach feminist business practice, coach entrepreneurs, and sort of serve as I like to call it a feminist in residence and sort of fixer for a handful of companies. So that's who I am and what I do.
Please tell us just a little bit about, where you grew up and how in the heck did you end up where you are now? We've talked a little bit before, and there's a lot of information here. So I'm always really interested to know, how did Petra become Petra?
Yeah, sure. Well, so where did I grow up? I grew up in a number of places. I was actually born in Montreal. My mother came over to Canada from Lübeck, Germany as an au pair girl, and unfortunately was molested by the man of the household. So left that after just a few weeks. She was quite young. She was about 18 years old. She had wanted to go there to learn English. While she was there, she met my father and was pregnant 3 months later. So the reason that's all relevant is she didn't actually have status here. I mean, she was here as a temporary worker. So as soon as I was born, we took the plane back to Germany as soon as she could put me on a plane because my mom and dad needed to go back to Germany. So I was born in Canada, but the first 8 years of my life were in Munich. And then we came back to Canada because of an opportunity for my father and moved to Vancouver and then spent 8 years in Winnipeg and eventually ended up in Toronto. So that's where, I guess you could say, where I grew up in all of those, the little parts of me in all of those places. And I guess I could also mention in terms of personal journey that my mom and dad divorced when I was about 10. And so after that, we moved around quite a bit. I was raised by my mom and we also had my sister. And she kind of became everyone's mom is their big influence in their life. But my mother was an amazing, resilient woman who, probably never earned more than $23,000 in her entire life. That was the most she'd ever earned in a year. But I like to think of her as sort of she was like a German Goldie Hawn in Butterflies Are Free. I think I grew up in a very bohemian style. So that probably influenced me to be comfortable working with lots of people outside of the mainstream.
You sound like a very international woman, which is apropos. So growing up, I like to think that I get to live a gypsy life in many ways. Do you feel like that was a gypsy childhood that you had?
So, yeah, I would say childhood in a nutshell was great. I mean, we lived in a one-bedroom apartment at one point in time with one bed, and all three of us slept there. And we didn't grow up in the nicest of neighborhoods. And I never felt like we lacked for anything, even though I know my mom, had to pull a couple of different jobs. I mentioned Gen X. This is back in the 70s when, maybe being a latchkey kid wouldn't have called in the child services offices quite so quickly. So, I was used to coming home by myself, and my sister and I would wait for my mother to come home. And then from working at the Canada Wheat Board as a key puncher, and then she would head out after that to her job as a hostess in a steakhouse and come home with leftover lobsters and steaks that I think were half eaten, but we didn't care. We just thought, we were having the most luxurious food in our house. And that's sort of how we grew up. So in that way, I've never been afraid of I think I grew up not being afraid of anything, whether you were living in your car or in a one-bedroom apartment, or later on when, things, fortunes changed for us a little bit, moving into a house with a pool when she remarried. And then when that marriage ended 5 years later, moving back to subsidized housing, I feel as though what I learned through all that is that you can always kind of get through just about anything.
This is true. There's always an answer. So we talked a little bit before, and I'm just curious. You mentioned your macrame business, but we also talked about Fifth Town.
Mm-hmm.
Where and when did you decide that you were going to create Fifth Town, and how does that fit into the whole scheme of things that led before that?
Yeah, so when I think about my entrepreneurial life, and I did have 18 years in corporate world as well, I think of entrepreneurship as something everybody will find out that they're going to have to do at some point in their life. And for me, there were different kinds of entrepreneurship, and this leads to Fifth Town. So when I was in university, this is past macrame, and by the way, the macrame did not sell very well. So I learned just because I liked doing it and I liked the product didn't mean everybody else would. Later in university, I went to journalism school and started a cleaning business because it was a recession at that point in time, in the 70s and or early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And there were no jobs to be had. I was self-funded through university, and I had to pay rent and tuition. So I thought a good thing to do would be to clean houses, even though my mother said it was a bad idea because I'd never cleaned anything in my entire life, as far as she knew. So I started that. That was my first rendezvous with what I call necessity-based entrepreneurship, and I had no idea how to start a company, but I figured I got a loan from the government to buy a vacuum cleaner and a beat-up Chevette, and got a friend of mine to start it with me. It ended up over 3 years being very successful. Very basic business, cleaning houses with a twist. So that was my first time with real entrepreneurship, and we sold that venture for money. And I actually was able to pay off my student loans and have some left over at the end. So I thought that was awesome. So fast forward to 20 years later, after a pretty successful corporate career, I had a baby. And as probably many listeners know, the economy is not set up for people who have babies. And I found pretty soon that as president of the McGraw-Hill company, that my travel schedule and just the commitment that I would need to make in order to keep that going would mean I wouldn't be home very much. And I didn't want to do that. We had one child and only could have one child. So I said, we don't need to do this, and I'm going to start another business as a way of finding a way to, have more control over my own time, but also integrate my daughter's life into, everyday life of her mom. So I didn't actually know what business to start, but my husband at the time grew up in a rural area called Prince Edward County, which I guess would be kind of like a version of Sonoma in Ontario. And I went to the economic development officer in the area, and I said, what do you need here? What kind of business would complement what's already going here. I didn't want to set up a business that would compete with something that was already there. And so he said, well, we have 38 wineries on the books. About 12 of them are open now. We have several more coming. But we used to have a lot of cheese factories here, but we don't have any anymore. There was one, but it was just a cheddar cheese factory, farmer owned, and it was very good, but there wasn't a lot of variety there. So I thought, I think I can make cheese. I had no idea about cheese. I've never lived in a rural area. I didn't even know you could milk a goat or sheep. I didn't know that they had, how many teats they had. And so I kind of just decided that the first thing I would do is check out the industry and see if I liked it. So the first thing I went to was the American Cheese Society conference, which was actually held in San Francisco that year. And I loved the people I met. And the people I most engaged with were the owners of Cowgirl Creamery, Sue, and her partner, whose name is Christina.
Great cheese, by
yeah,
the way.
and great cheese. And they took me on as an intern for 2 weeks to learn how to make cheese. And from there, I said, I love this industry. I love the community. I love working with my hands. I'm going to make cheese. So I came back to Canada and started the process. So I took a lot of courses because I didn't want to just build a cheese factory. I wanted to be a cheese baker. So I took a lot of courses at the University of Guelph in food science and cheese making, and also at the University of Vermont, where they had an artisan cheese course there. And while I was learning how to make cheese and having my cheese assessed by experts and telling me how terrible it was, keeping my notebook, copious notes about, the weather that day and what the humidity was and why the cheese turned out differently that day than it had, a month before. And in the meantime, I bought land, had to have it rezoned. It went through, 9 ministries and 62 regulatory acts before we could open our doors, because I also wanted to build the world's greenest cheese factory. I wanted to reinvent how artisan cheese was made, not the how in the vat, like sort of the cheese itself, but also the building and the waste that's produced by cheese making, whey, and how to process that. And so we set out to build the world's greenest dairy. So that meant we had to help the regulators add new products to their certified product list on, what you can build a cheese factory out of, the glues you use, the building materials, etc. And it took about 4 years before we finally opened our doors. But we opened our doors as the first platinum LEED dairy in the world and the first platinum LEED manufacturing facility in Canada. And it took some effort. We had a biodigesting wetland for whey digestion, so no whey left the property. We had underground aging caves, which at the time there were only about 25 of them in North America. And ours were managed by geothermal tubes within the cement that was poured underground. And we also had wind power, solar power, because when you're doing green energy things in a factory, you need to have sort of duplicating systems in case one doesn't work. On a non-sunny day, you need the wind and that sort of thing. So that's how I got into the dairy business, sort of just by asking that area what they needed and trying to make that happen and trying to build a business that would complement and elevate everything else that was already there and coming.
I love it. We're at that halfway point, so we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment, and we'll talk a little bit more about evolution and LiisBeth.
Sure.
This is Heartstock. This is Heartstock Radio, and I'm Carol Murphy, your host. Our guest today is Petra Kassun-Mutch. Hi again, Petra.
Hi.
So let's fast forward again to what you're doing now. You've got two ventures, it seems, going on here, maybe more even. Evolution. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what Evolution is and why you started?
Yes. So Evolution is basically about feminist business consulting. And LiisBeth, which is sort of a division of Evolution, is a magazine and media company where we basically write about the feminist economy, the work of feminist entrepreneurs, feminist scholars, how that can inform the work of feminist entrepreneurs. And we basically actively seek to profile ventures who are experimenting with different organizational design, different ownership models, different practices within their ventures, everything from governance to decision-making to procurement philosophies, things like that. So that's what Evolution and LiisBeth is all about.
We've talked about this on a couple different occasions on the show, how this feminist approach is a little bit different when it's applied to business. And I noticed on your website, specifically in reference to LiisBeth, a mention of progressive feminist lens. Can you define what that means? I think that sounds pretty darn cool.
Yeah, well, we call it progressive because people familiar with the feminist discourse and so on will probably, there's often talk about the 3 or 4 waves of feminism. And what I think about as far as progressive feminist lens is obviously it needs to be intersectional in recognition of the fact that not all women experience life equally, and there are a variety of intersectional types of oppressions that women with different backgrounds can experience. So not every woman's experience is the same. So that's one part of the progressive side of feminism, to sort of differentiate it from its previous sort of mainstream incarnation, which didn't think about women's experiences that way. The other piece to it is oftentimes, from a radical feminist point of view, and I consider myself a radical feminist, I'm interested in not just reforming existing systems the way they are and finding ways for women to succeed within those systems. I'm more interested in changing those systems, entirely. A lot of people think of feminists as anti-capitalist, and when I say radical feminism, it's not about anti-capitalism from a progressive point of view. It's about a different kind of capitalism. We could go quite deeply into that, but I'll suffice to say that our definition of progressive is really about feminists who look towards leveraging business, venture creation, and innovation and so on to sort of not only create products and services, but also to sort of redefine how business can be done and look at different processes and methods that ultimately create a much deeper experience of inclusion, is able to unleash the benefits of diversity much more powerfully. And these are people who are really experimenting with some pretty radical ideas. And I have lots of examples of them on the website. And the hope is that if these are the social laboratories that kind of exist on the fringe of the entrepreneurship innovation space, that their work, which often goes unnoticed or unrecognized because it's not the kind of work that's going to be venture capital friendly necessarily, but it is work that really informs new ideas, new ways of doing things in the social enterprise and social innovation space, but often also finds its way into mainstream business by way of diversity and inclusion advocates who work inside corporations.
I love what you said, a new type of capitalism.
Yes.
Are there some pillars of this feminine model of capitalism?
Yeah, some examples, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, what are the hallmarks maybe, or certainly examples would be good too.
Some examples. I mean, one of the key concerns about current capitalism, the way capitalism has sort of evolved and kind of been shaped, is that it generates a great deal of inequality, and we know this, and it's generating even greater inequality. And alternative forms of capitalism, which still is based on the beauty of trading, like humans have traded and skills and products and services for centuries. And there's a really terrific book that I want to mention by Anna Lowenhaupt Singh, which is called The Mushroom at the End of the World. And it's about the mushroom trade, and it's a beautiful example of capitalism at its best. It's very simple, it's very earnest, eye to eye, an effort to be fair. So when we think of where capitalism can go, we can say that it would be great if that we created mechanisms which more fairly distributed some of the wealth. And we're not talking about everybody being exactly on the same level, but we're talking about fair distribution of wealth, alternative ownership models, and the way that you trade, so that it's not all about win-win or taking or disruption. When we look at Uber or companies like that, technology companies have done a great job of so-called disrupting industries. But what if Uber was a feminist company? How would they have gone about disrupting the industry in a way that maybe didn't cause as much displacement of other cab drivers and things like that? How would they have done that differently? And in fact, we have an article on the magazine online called "What If Uber Was a Feminist Business?" And that's asking yourself that question is a great way of looking at how feminist theory and concepts might actually alter the way companies run, start up, grow, and how they approach dealing with the displacement that they often cause while they're disrupting. So I'm hoping that answers part of the question. But so it's about wealth distribution. It's about fairness. We talk about feminist business values in terms of 5 areas. So one is whole humanness, recognizing that founders and entrepreneurs are whole humans, that yes, it's okay to bring your baby on stage to the pitch competition. Agency, making sure that everyone you deal with in your value chain, has a sense of being heard and, have a sense of being heard and contributing. We talk about interdependence, and we talk about generativity, which is one of my favorite ones, is how can you make something that's a 1 + 1 = 5? And there's some great techniques and some great ideas around how you can look at your enterprise ecosystem and come up with ways and strategies where you go, this player's in here, it's a not-for-profit. This is my competitor, but possibly a potential ally. And we are all struggling with a similar problem. How can the 3 of us, unlikely, cross-sector people working in different ways in the same space, come together to come up with something that can help all of us and also help our various stakeholders? So creative, innovative ways of working within the ecosystem that supports your business and that is part of who your business serves cross-sectorally is a part of, feminist business practice.
So when you work with founders, how do they find you? And is there a process that you use to, expose them and open their minds to some of these concepts?
Yeah, so they can find us we do have a website, www.evolution.com, so EVE-VOLTUION.com. Find us there. We publish reading lists. We also have certainly the magazine. That's what the magazine is all about. So I encourage people to read those. It's all open access. It's free. You don't have to pay anything. So read the stories because we publish some absolutely great case studies around the kinds of work that people do, including, de-genderizing your website in terms of how you're talking to your customers and that sort of thing. So great articles there, reading lists. And we also run an annual conference called the Entrepreneurial Feminist Forum in Toronto, and we run a lot of workshops by experts from the field, and then most of them are grassroots experts. It's interesting. We're probably one of the few business conferences that doesn't have a big corporate CEO on stage. And they're very think and do oriented, meant to actually roll up your sleeves and start experimenting and working collaboratively to maybe even refine and advance whatever the presenter is working on. So it's not a top-down sort of unloading on this is how you do it. It's more of a here's my idea how we can advance this. Now let's all work while we're in the room to see how we can make it even better. And then we can all walk away with a tool or an idea or a process that we can integrate into our own business.
We've got about 2 minutes left, and I'm just wondering, do you only work with women, or is this something that we all can benefit from?
Yes, we don't only work with women, but we do only work with people who are interested in exploring what feminist theory, feminist practice, and pedagogy can do to make their business more competitive, more productive, and more socially generative going forward. So, yeah, I always say we serve feminists of all genders.
We've got just about a minute left, and maybe we can share how folks might find you. You shared a little bit of that before, but are there other ways that people might find you?
So the main method would be the website, I guess. If you're outside of Toronto, certainly contact us there. And again, through the magazine, I do want to mention we also accept queries from writers all over the world. We've written about feminist enterprises in India and the UK and of course, the United States. And right now, about 50% of our readership online is actually U.S.-based. So, yeah, you can reach us there as a potential client, but also if you have something to say or a story to tell, or you're doing something in your business that's really cool, that's kind of aligned with feminist ideas about the future, then about possible futures, then tell us about it, and we may also publish. And by the way, we pay all of our contributors.
Nice.
That's part of a feminist value as well.
This is Heartstock Radio, and thank you so much, Petra, for being on the show. And I feel like you are a whirlwind.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Carol. Really appreciate it. And congratulations on all the work that you do as well.
Oh, thank you.
With your business also.
Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you. Back at you.
See you next week. Peace.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
On the sign it said, no trespass.
Heartstock Radio is a production of KBMF 102.5 Butte America Radio. Hear our live programs every Friday at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time via livestream at butteamericaradio.org.
That time was made for you and me.